Bobby Witt Jr. is having an unbelievable season. I think it's probably not being stated enough how good an overall season
Is it because he's in Kansas City?
I think it's just people don't realize, like, the guy's putting up what might be like a top 15, top 10 all time. We're talking like anybody that's played the game of baseball offensive season. That's how good he's been this year. It's kind of insane. He's hitting right now 336 with 30 homers, 28 steals. He's got an on-base percentage of almost 400, a slugging of almost 600, an OPS of almost 1,000. And he's playing great defense at shortstop, which I think probably doesn't get talked enough about, the fact that he's really putting together a whole package kind of deal.
We've had our Met fan conversations about Francisco Lindor sort of, getting overlooked a little bit in the wake of Shohei Ohtani. Well, I'd say Bobby Witt is probably having a better season than is Francisco Lindor. And by the metrics you just explained, that would be the case.
Pretty dominant. The problem is that he's, playing in the American League, and Aaron Judge is there, who's having an equally historic season, but for Judge it just seems sort of normal at this point. But it was interesting when I was, thinking about this. Who was this got me thinking, who's the biggest snub in MVP award history or overall in baseball? Because certainly awards like Cy Young, we've gotten a lot better about kind of picking guys out. And I'm sure you can remember plenty of guys, because I think if we're going to start, who biggest snubs ever, the 1984 AL MVP race.
You went there first, huh?
You kind of have to go there first, because that might just, not so much that maybe Ripken did or didn't deserve to win it, but he certainly didn't deserve not to get any votes.
Well, that's really the amazing thing, right? Because Willie Hernandez of the Tigers, won the MVP award, and he was a relief pitcher for those that don't know. And the '84 Tigers famously got off to a 35-5 start, but this is important, and led wire to wire and won the World Series. So how can a closer for a team that was 30 games over 500 after 40 games, be the most important guy in the team? They'd already won.
He didn't even lead the American League in saves. The guy on the Royals led the league in saves.
So it was at a time where winning, obviously, and that's only 40 years ago, but winning, being on a winning team was the key element in your being an MVP.
Now, this is what I don't know. I don't know how good the Orioles were in '84, so they might not have been very good.
They were okay.
But it still doesn't explain how Ripken, who led the American League in WAR that season, and I'm going to let you know, by a pretty good margin, nobody was within
10 more seasons, right?
Nobody was within 2 WAR of him.
Yeah.
He got 1 vote for MVP. Not one first place vote, people. A single vote for MVP.
And as a shortstop, you think about what Ripken did at that time. If you would look at those statistics in today's, and say the guy played good defense. He was a very good defensive shortstop.
Hit 304.
He hit he did
everything.
And he played shortstop.
He played every game.
He did that every year.
But that's something you have to talk about. He played 162 games at short, hit 304 with 27 homers at a time where the best hitters generally hit 27 homers. So having your shortstop give that to you was unprecedented. So I think that's one that gets talked about a lot, just because what impressed me, what was surprising to me, is I'm looking through this list of MVP guys, and guys, Tony Armas finished 7th in MVP voting. He put up 2.6 WAR. But he hit 43 home runs, and that's what he led the league in RBIs, and he led the league in homers.
And those glamour stats really, got the attention of voters, in these awards. And so if you had 150, we think about Juan Gonzalez, and he won 2 MVPs, one in 1996 and one in 1998. In neither year was he, really the best player in the league. He just had gaudy stats in RBIs both of those years. I think he had 157 one year and 141 in the other. But there are players like in 1996, Alex Rodriguez, his teammate, who far outpaced him and was a much better defender.
Oh, yeah.
Which isn't saying much, by the way, when you're talking about Juan Gon, who wasn't much of a defender. And then Albert Bell had, I think, 2 or 3 point more in WAR at the time. And it's important to note that at the time we weren't using WAR as a metric. There was no way to go back and look at that in 1996 or 1998 and go, oh, wow, this guy blew him away in WAR. Nobody knew about that.
Nobody knew about that, and that is something that you see now. I think it's a bigger issue with the Cy Young than the MVP, because the traditional counting stats for MVP, with maybe the exception of RBIs, aren't really that fluky. Like, you can't accidentally hit 300. You know what I mean? But there have been plenty of guys that did not put together stellar pitching seasons that sort of walked backwards into a 20-win season. And so much of Cy Young voting was just based purely off of whoever was winning the most games. That's how you end up things like the 1973 AL Cy Young, where Bert Blyleven pitches an unbelievable season and Finn gets 1 vote for Cy Young, losing out to Jim Palmer, who had a very good year, but when you look at his numbers compared to Blyleven, they're kind of crazy.
I'm working on a post right now, actually, that says, when you look at the pitching Triple Crown, I don't want to get off track too much here,
right,
but wins are a part of the pitching Triple Crown.
Undoubtedly.
It's such a derivative stat, as we've talked about many times in this podcast, that I thought, well, if you took out wins and you had WHIP be the other one, ERA, strikeouts, and WHIP, I think that would be a better measure of what happened, because basically the wins are oftentimes dependent on how many runs your team scored. It doesn't matter how well you pitched.
Right, exactly. That's why you look at things like the 2005 Cy Young race in the AL, where Johan Santana loses inexplicably to Bartolo Colon because Colon went 21-8 while Santana only went 16-7. But you look at literally every other statistic, and Santana blows him out of the water. Threw more innings, gave up less hits, had a better ERA, struck out more guys, had a lower WHIP. Like, the guy was the best pitcher, clearly, but he didn't get wins because that's a team statistic as much as anything else.
I think Felix Hernandez kind of fixed that finally when he won the Cy Young with a 13-12 record. All of a sudden, that was an acknowledgement on the voters' part that the wins were a derivative stat and not as important. But I wanted to ask you something about that. So about pitchers in general. So, the Cy Young Award didn't get started until, I think, 55, something like that, 1955. Before that, any player could win the MVP, and there was no specific award for best pitcher.
Right.
Since that time, there have been pitchers, as we just mentioned, Willie Hernandez, and another relief pitcher, Mike Marshall, for the Dodgers in the 70s, won the MVP. Should pitchers really be considered for most valuable player when the hitters can't ever be named, Cy Young?
Well, I think it's sort of the reverse now, because one, it's just so hard to win the MVP as a pitcher for the most part, because you have to have such an unbelievable year or be Shohei Ohtani to really have a chance at that. Because if Pedro Martinez's 2002 didn't even get him more than a single vote for MVP, pitcher's not winning an MVP anytime soon.
I have a way it could happen, and I thought about this. So basically, pitchers make 32 starts now, right? It's 160 starts, and then they fill in the other couple starts. So if the pitcher made all 32 of those starts, pitching every 5th day, and he had 28 times of those 32 his team won, and he won 20 of those, but he was lifted in the game, and they somehow won the
sort of a new win statistic.
Eight games. And this way, he went in so now that he's been responsible for 28 of those 32, and his team in the other 130 games of those 32 went 65 and 65, a 500 team. They end up winning 93 games because of the 28 games. All of a sudden, who's the most valuable player?
You could make that guy's 28 starts was the difference between them being sitting at home and being in the postseason.
It's a fluky thing, and by the way, winning 28 out of your team's 32 starts
it might not have anything to do with it.
Would be crazy to happen.
Also, you look at something like this. David Peterson right now looks like the best pitcher in Major League Baseball, but that's in part because the Mets just decide to score a zillion runs every time he pitches. So it's any pitcher is going to win a bunch of games when the teams average 7 runs in your starts for some reason.
And the other thing I want to ask you is, and we've seen it, and I guess you'll say important, because how important is the team making the playoffs to the MVP chance?
Extremely important, because we don't like giving the MVP to people that didn't make the playoffs.
Unless you're Andre Dawson in 1987 with the Cubs. They were a last-place team, and he got the MVP, which people are still complaining about.
I think the only way you the best ways to win an MVP are to be either on an absolutely amazing team or the worst team in baseball. Because if you're playing on the worst team in baseball and you still put up an MVP season, they're going to give it to you because, oh my God, imagine the season that this guy would put up if he had any kind of help. And if you're on the best team, well, you're always going to give it to the best player. It's sort of the default to go, well, who's the best player on the best team in each league? Okay, well, Aaron Judge and the Yankees. Okay, yeah, that's a pretty easy vote. Shohei Ohtani and the Dodgers. Yeah, that's a pretty easy vote. It's generally going to go to whichever guy is on the league-leading team that's playing the best.
And it should be, right, because I'm not a believer in, the old joke, we could finish in last place without you, even if you had the great season that like Andre Dawson did in 1987 to win the MVP. Going, well, yeah, but what did that do? They ended up finishing last. There had to be a player who was more valuable to his team. That was a good team.
I think there is a point. Let's put it this way: if you put Shohei Ohtani or Aaron Judge on the Chicago White Sox this season, everything else is the same. Nothing
be better.
changes. Right. Would you give Aaron Judge the MVP? He's playing on the 33-win White Sox team. He's got the exact same offensive stats.
Well, I would say that, yeah, I want to give him the MVP because he has no protection on this, so doing it on the White Sox would be even more amazing.
It becomes an interesting thought experiment.
Right.
Because you're like, okay, what is the line that I would give somebody the MVP for?
We don't need your help to lose 123 games, hopefully.
No, certainly
you're
not.
the White Sox. So, and there are other seasons where guys have ridiculous seasons that you think, well, how did that not win? And then because somebody else had an even better season, like in 2003 with Albert Pujols, who had a 9.5 WAR, had 43 homers, batted .359 with a .439 on base, .667 slugging, and played very well defensively. He led the majors in batting average, runs scored, doubles, total bases, and total hits. So he finished second to Barry Bonds, who had 45 home runs, so he had a couple of home runs more. The 529 on base, 749 slugging. I mean, are you kidding?
Well, the biggest difference isn't with their stats. It's with their team stats, because Bonds was on the first place.
There you go.
San Francisco Giants, who won the NL West, while Albert Pujols was on the middling St. Louis Cardinals, who missed the playoffs.
They had a winning record, but that wasn't enough.
That wasn't enough. Not when Bonds I think it's the biggest thing is when there's two guys that are close to each other, and one guy's on a playoff team and one guy's not on a playoff team. As much as you like to say, well, it's not his, one guy's fault that he has worse teammates. The other guy lifted his team and made the playoffs. You got to give him a nod for that. It's like, it's always going to hurt.
And maybe there's a bias for San Francisco Giants because Jeff Kent did the same thing to Todd Helton, right, in 2000. Right. And I think everybody that knows anything about baseball
knows about that
one. Right, that Todd Helton got into the Hall of Fame, and he should have got the MVP in the year 2000 when he had a ridiculous, season. And Jeff Kent, who was on a better team, had a very, very good season at a difficult position to be productive at second base. Mm-hmm. So that kind of got everybody's head to go, oh, he's doing this as a second baseman.
And they might have learned their lesson in that 2000 season from 4 years earlier when they didn't give it to A-Rod. Because A-Rod in 96 put together an unbelievable season. Like, you look at the season, it is just wild how good it was. Except he lost to Juan Gonzalez, who won his second MVP at the time. Juan Gonzalez had 47 home runs and batted .314. So it's not surprising.
It wasn't like it was a bad season.
No.
It just wasn't as good as we think the other season is.
And then you couple that with not playing great defense, and A-Rod playing great defense.
And that's where the WAR makes it easier to understand.
Right.
And even though I'm still juggling between Fangraphs WAR and Baseball Reference WAR because they don't value things the same, as we've mentioned before in this podcast.
Specifically with defense, they do defensive calculations.
It really makes a difference. But no one's ever going to argue that Juan Gonzalez was a defensive player anywhere near what A-Rod was, and even when he wasn't a good defensive player, A-Rod late in his career. So I think where you play. So and also Helton had the Colorado bias, right? He played in Colorado. How much of those stats were?
Right, how much does that really
the
matter?
Out there, the ball went further, and that happened maybe to Ellis Burks in '96, who also had a fantastic season.
Who lost to another NL West player,
right? Whose team had a better record and a better team. Ken Caminiti won.
Caminiti had an unbelievable season. He actually put up better WAR than Ellis Burks in that season, 7.5 to 7.2, and Caminiti batted almost .330 with 40 homers. So again, that's an example of a year where somebody else really put up stellar offensive numbers
and didn't do it in Colorado.
Right.
I think that's
probably what I did not realize before we started looking into this is that there were maybe even some more egregious ones that took place back in the day. Because if we go back to the 40s and the time a little bit before that, I think we have 3 cases for some of the most wild snubs of all time. And I don't know which one to start with, because I think Ted Williams not winning the 1941 MVP is very well known amongst historical baseball fans. But it wasn't like DiMaggio had a bad year that year.
Well, he had that was the year DiMaggio had the glowing 56-game hitting streak. Nobody could see anything. And the Yankees won.
Right.
They won the pennant. They won the World Series again. And so all of that, and it was Joe DiMaggio. It was Joe DiMaggio.
The best player on the best
Everybody
team.
loved Joe DiMaggio. Nobody really loved Ted Williams unless you were from Boston at the time. He was
Now, I think and Ted Williams put together maybe the best offensive season. He hit 406 that year.
Wait, stop. He hit 406!
Right. That's just one of them. He had a 221 rated runs created plus. That means he's basically 2.2 times better than the average person.
And nobody knew that, by the way, because we
Right.
didn't have that
We didn't
stat in
have that stat back then.
1941.
But then what's even wilder is that a Yankee got snubbed 7 years before that, and I think that might actually be the most egregious snub in baseball history. Because Lou Gehrig didn't win the MVP in 1934. He lost it to a manager.
No, he's a player manager. Mickey Cochran was a player manager. Come on.
Oh, wow, yeah, okay. But, I mean, come on. Look at the season DiMaggio put together.
No, Gehrig.
Gehrig, he led the league in home runs, WAR, batting average, on base, slugging, and RBIs. He won the Triple Crown and didn't finish first in MVP voting. He didn't even finish second or third or fourth. He finished fifth. He won the Triple Crown and finished fifth. I don't even understand because that was traditional counting statistics back in the day. So what happened in 1934? Did the Great Depression affect their ability to evaluate baseball?
And Gehrig and Chuck Klein are guys that won the Triple Crown and did not win the MVP, which is amazing to me that could even happen.
Gehrig didn't even finish. He wasn't even the highest vote getter on his team. Lefty Gomez beat him out, the pitcher, somehow.
So I think that might be because Mickey Cochran. Now the Tigers were good that year, and that was the rare year the Yankees didn't win. Right, so they didn't make the playoffs, and the Tigers were on a rise, and they made the World Series that year, and they won the next year in 1935. So they were part of a good team. So but being player manager, maybe people waited the fact that he was player manager. I mean, he had a good season, but not an MVP season.
Certainly not. And then lastly, to kind of talk about, at least in terms of the old historical ones, was Babe Ruth not winning the 1931 MVP. Now, Ruth does only have one MVP, but that's mostly because of a byproduct of when he played and the award not existing for most of it.
And it wasn't right. It wasn't really even called. It didn't get called the MVP.
It's called the League Award, I think.
The League Award, correct.
Now, wasn't there some kind of weird stipulation that you couldn't win it more than one time?
There was indeed.
So you could win the League Award, and they're like, okay, you're good. We got to give it to somebody else now. Just immediately, imagine Shohei being like, okay, Shohei, you got your MVP. We got to let other people.
Somebody else has got to have a turn now.
Yeah.
You have to take a step aside. Willie Mays had that happen to him too in 1955. And Roy Campanella of the Dodgers, and that was being a catcher, right? He won the MVP, and he didn't have anywhere stats near what Willie did. He hit 318. Willie hit 319. He hit 32 home runs at Campanella. Willie hit 51 home runs.
It's pretty good.
That's a big difference, right? And Campanella, this was a year the Dodgers won the World Series. That was the year they finally won. Now, you're not supposed to vote on the MVP,
but that's what we see
for the playoffs. You have to vote before the playoffs.
But you see so much of when you look back at these older MVP races, the guys that won were the teams that won the World Series.
Right, and so I thought the voting was, though, that you voted after the season, but before the playoffs.
They were way too good with selecting the event.
I don't know. It seems a little weird to me.
There was way too many World Series winners that ended up as the MVP for me to think it was totally before the fact.
So that was just 1955 was just the Dodgers' year, and because they did that, and in 1961, and that was the year, obviously, that Maris and Mantle had the home run chase, and Maris broke Babe Ruth's record, and so that was iconic.
So right. That's going to immediately bury any other story that happened in that series, because I didn't even know this guy had this season. We're talking about Norm Cash.
I had Norm Cash's baseball card when I was a
Detroit Tiger
kid.
first
It was
baseman.
late in his career. He was old, but you look at that 1961, you think, wow, the guy hit 361. He never batted 300 any other season, by the way. He hit 41 home runs. Never did anything like that before.
Now, is there possible the reason he didn't win the MVP that year is because he used a corked bat that season?
Well, yeah, and I saw that in the notes here. That what did they write? It's very like they know this for a fact. Cash used a corked bat that season. Well, did he say, I used a cork bat?
Right, that's a very big statement to make.
How did they know? And so, I don't know. And so that we kind of give it a pass because we didn't really know. But he didn't win the MVP anyway.
So it doesn't matter.
So it didn't
we're safe on that
Mickey
one.
Mantle, I think, was second in the MVP voting that year. And rightly so, because he probably had a better year than Roger Maris, by the way. So, I think another one that I wanted to mention, one more, is Carl Yastrzemski. who did win an MVP in 1967, but 3 years later in 1970, he didn't win the MVP. And once again, it's the same old thing, right? That was the year the Orioles won the pennant and the World Series after losing to the Mets in '69. Boog Powell was a big, power-hitting first baseman.
35 homers.
Nice player.
Right. I'm going to say,
Nice
he
player.
won the MVP
That's
because
it.
he was playing on the first place team and he hit the most home runs. That's why he got that MVP.
Right, because there's nothing about his stats, and other than, he played for the Orioles who won, and the Red Sox finished 21 games behind the Orioles in the AL East.
That might be a bit of the reason why.
So that was the bias that's there. It's really hard to, and I do think there is an attachment to that, as I said before, in terms of you being the MVP and having your team. It's got to be halfway decent, or at least be competitively, in the race, something like that.
Even with advanced stats, I think we get to the point where it's just like, okay, it doesn't matter how good your advanced stats show you. Your team didn't win.